Hello and welcome to another fun-filled edition of Adam's Music Box, where today we take a look at the what I still consider the lost Steely Dan album. It was certainly their lost for a while and the end of their first run. Some would say that it's their crowning achievement, certainly along with Asia from a few years earlier. It showed what Steely Dan always sort of was destined to grow into, which was a neurotically perfectionist yet still groovy studio-based band that, in addition to its core, well, its only members, its founding members of Donald Fagen and Walter Becker, it was a band that was featured or a band that did feature so many different musicians from so many walks of life, mainly from the jazz fusion side of things, but certainly not exclusively. I just want to read you some of the names that were on this album. So Steve Kahn, great guitar player if you're unaware of him. Jeff Porcaro, we all know and love him, one of the king of studio drumming, and of course Mr. Toto himself. Michael Brecker, the legendary jazz saxophonist. Anthony Jackson, what a great bass guitarist. Victor Feldman, great hand percussionist, and of course Steve Gadd, along with Jeff Porcaro, sort of the king of studio drums in that era, frankly, late 70s, all of the 70s, really, into the 80s. Mark Knopfler from Dire Straits is on the album. He plays on the Time Out of Mind song. David Sanborn, wonderful saxophonist who we lost earlier this year. Michael McDonald's backing vocals all over the album. Chuck Rainey, one of the finest bass players ever, all over the album. Bernard Purdie, the Shuffle King, all over the album. Tom Scott, the great saxophonist. Tired yet? Because there's more. Hiram Bollock, great guitar player who really sort of came of age in the 80s. Rick Derringer, yes, that Rick Derringer. Also, honestly, I said it wasn't exclusively your jazz fusion people. Larry Carlton, who had been on Asia as well. Great. Such a wonderful sense of harmony in that guitar playing. Joe Sample of the Crusaders on the electric piano. And I'm still not done with the list. Patty Austin, one of my favorite singers, does backing vocals. Leslie Miller, another great pianist and backing vocalist. Who else have we got here? Dan Gronlich, very great musician. And the list could go on. Rick Murata, a great drummer. So it gives you the idea that this really was sort of, along with Asia, but I think even more on this album, the who's who of musicians, of jazz musicians, jazz fusion musicians, and even up and coming rock musicians. There really was a bit of everything on this album. And dare I say that stylistically, it's a bit more diverse than Asia, because these albums are always being compared. So that, of course, is going to be inevitable. Now, there was also a lawsuit that was involved in this album because the title track was one that definitely referenced Keith Jarrett, a Keith Jarrett riff, if you will. And eventually, Keith Jarrett sued because he said, look, this isn't just sort of a quotation from my Long as You Know You're Living Yours, a song that he wrote a few years earlier in 1974. That was originally from his Belonging album. And it was years after Gaucho was released. He said, hang on, I think I should get a writing credit for the title track to Gaucho, which he did. They eventually settled the lawsuit. I don't think there were any hard feelings because the thing with both Fagan and Becker is they were idol worshipping so many jazz musicians that they grew up with. And after falling first into sort of commercial jingle writing and then into the world of rock and pop, they basically went on a two-man mission to jazzify and fusionify rock music as much as possible. And you can hear that incrementally happening over the course of the first three or four Steely Dan albums. But it eventually became quite clear that their mission to jazzify rock was so successful that by the final three albums of that original run of Steely Dan, it really was essentially jazz fusion music that was being marketed to rock audiences. They came a long way from, let's say, Reeling in the Years, which, yes, had some jazz and soul influences, but when you compare that to basically ripping off Keith Jarrett, Sorry, paying tribute to Keith Jarrett, now that the legal settlement has gone through. It's really worlds away in a very short amount of time. And again, I do think Gaucho was sort of the ultimate, sort of the climax and conclusion simultaneously to this journey that Steely Dan were on to, trick rock audiences into listening to jazz fusion. A rather easier thing to do in the 70s and early 80s than it would have been subsequently, but still not the easiest thing to do, and yet they did it. Gaucho, if nothing else, is mission accomplished, and of course, a great audiophile test disc over the years. Like, subscribe, and we'll see you next time. Take care.